It was always tough, but I enjoyed it. I enjoy it. Like, I know I'm going to enjoy it here because it's just...
It was supposed to be an ordinary day at Graceland. A team of restorers had been dusting the corners of Elvis Presley's upstairs dressing room. The part of the mansion rarely touched, sealed off like a time capsule since 1977. For nearly 5 decades, no one had gone through every drawer, every frame, every hidden crack. Until one worker noticed something odd. The corner of an old envelope wedged behind a mirror frame, its paper yellowed and curling from years of silence. At first, they thought it was nothing, maybe a misplaced fan letter or a receipt from his touring days. But the handwriting stopped them cold, strong, slanted, familiar. It was his, Elvis's own script, faded but unmistakable. Inside, folded with care, was a single sheet of stationery marked personal. No address, no date, just the faint smell of cologne and time. They handed it to the Graceland curator, who realized instantly that this wasn't a scrap. This was something meant to stay hidden. The paper trembled in her hands as she opened it, and what she read wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't lyrics or poetry. It was something else entirely. A kind of confession. The first line alone changed the room's energy. It read, "If anyone finds this, I hope they understand before they judge me." No one spoke for a long time. In that moment, the mythology of Elvis Presley, the king, the icon, the untouchable superstar, cracked open just enough to show the man inside. This letter wasn't written to fans, to the press, or to anyone in his circle. It seemed meant for whoever might stumble upon it long after he was gone. Almost like he knew someday someone would. For decades, we thought we knew Elvis. We saw the jumpsuits, the crowds, the music, the glory. We told ourselves he was larger than life. But what if that wasn't the truth? What if behind the gold records and the bright lights, there was a man desperate to say something? Something he couldn't tell anyone while he was alive. The discovery of this letter reopened wounds Graceland had quietly tried to protect. Every inch of that house had been preserved in amber, a shrine to the image, not the pain. But this letter, this changed that. It reminded everyone that Graceland wasn't just a monument, it was a memory box. And memory boxes don't always hold pretty things. When the curator finally read the full page aloud to the small restoration team, some swore they could feel the air shift. The words were personal, spiritual, heavy with regret, as if Elvis had been writing not just to clear his conscience, but to explain his silence. There were hints of promises broken, people he wished he could have protected, and something about the burden of being two men at once. That line especially echoed long after. Who was he talking about? Himself and the public image? The man and the myth? Or something even deeper, the sinner and the believer? The performer and the lost soul behind the curtain? For years, fans argued about who Elvis really was. Some saw a lonely genius crushed by fame. Others saw a man undone by excess. But this letter, this quiet, fragile piece of paper, whispered a third story. One that suggested he knew exactly how the world saw him and hated it. And maybe that's why he hid it. Maybe that's why it was behind the mirror. The one thing in Graceland he faced every morning. A mirror sees the truth, even when the world doesn't. The letter wasn't signed with the usual EP or Elvis Presley. It ended differently, simply. I just hope someone will forgive me when I can't explain anymore. That single line turned the myth into a man again. A man who knew his end was coming. A man who didn't want the world's pity, just its understanding. What had he done that needed forgiveness? What secret was he trying to bury inside those walls? When the team locked the room again that night, no one said a word. They left the mirror untouched, the letter sealed once more in an envelope, and the silence hung heavy. It felt like the king was still there, not watching, but waiting. Waiting for the world to finally read the words he never could say out loud. Because if this letter was real, and every indication said it was, then everything we thought we knew about Elvis Presley, the man behind the legend, was about to change forever. For years, we built our idea of Elvis Presley on everything we could see. The perfect smile, the stage swagger, the godlike voice that could hush an entire arena. But the letter found behind that mirror, it hinted at a different kind of man. One not surrounded by applause, but haunted by it. And to understand what he wrote and why, you have to go back. Back to the moment when Elvis stopped being a person and became an idea. He was barely 20 when the world discovered him. A shy boy from Tupelo with trembling hands who sang like he was born carrying every prayer of the South in his throat. His rise wasn't gradual, it was volcanic. One year, he was driving trucks in Memphis. The next, he was standing under blinding lights, drowning in screams that never seemed to end. People called it a miracle. Elvis called it something else. A blessing that came too fast, he once said. Everyone saw the fame, but few saw what it took from him. Nights when he couldn't walk down the street without cameras. Dinners that turned into interrogations. The pressure to smile even when he felt like crumbling. By the mid-60s, he wasn't just a man anymore. He was a brand, a product, a crown too heavy to remove. The world demanded Elvis the King, but the boy who sang gospel in tiny churches never stopped missing the silence. That's the part most people never saw. The loneliness that came from being loved by millions and known by none. He once said to a friend, "Everyone wants to be near me, but nobody really wants to know me." That wasn't arrogance, it was exhaustion. And maybe that's why the words in the letter felt so different. Because for once, he wasn't writing as the king. He was writing as the boy who'd lost himself somewhere between Graceland's golden gates and the echo of 1,000 flashbulbs. His fans remember the glamour, the generosity, the way he'd buy strangers' cars and feed whole families. But few realize how much of it came from guilt. A guilt that seemed to chase him from his mother's death onward. Gladys Presley was the one person who saw him without the stage lights. And when she passed, something broke that he never repaired. Every song about love after that had a trace of mourning in it. Every laugh had a shadow behind it. That letter seemed to come from that same shadow. A voice that wanted to speak without being heard by the world. There were lines about promises he'd made to keep them all safe, about hurting people he loved by trying to save them, and a cryptic mention of the things fame made me forget to feel. It wasn't self-pity, it was confession, the kind that only makes sense when a man realizes he can't go back. Fame had given Elvis everything: money, power, worship, but it had quietly stolen his sense of peace. He turned to gospel because it reminded him of who he was before all this. He filled Graceland with pastors, psychics, and friends who called him E, not King. But even among them, he often seemed distant, as if part of him lived in another room, a room no one else was allowed to enter. And that's what made the letter so haunting. It wasn't the words themselves. It was who he was talking to. It didn't sound like it was meant for a person. It sounded like it was meant for God, or maybe for the version of himself he'd left behind. When he wrote about the promise he couldn't keep, maybe it wasn't to Priscilla or his fans. Maybe it was to himself, the boy who swore he'd never let the music become bigger than his soul. But somewhere along the way, it did. By the early 70s, even his closest friends saw it. The pills, the weight, the long nights of pacing through Graceland halls, searching for something that wasn't there. He still sang, still smiled, but his eyes told another story, one that looked eerily like the one written in that letter. He knew people saw him as immortal, but he felt more fragile than ever. Every performance became an apology, every bow a silent plea for peace. He once said, "I'm so tired of being Elvis Presley. I just want to be me again." And that's the tragedy behind the myth, because the man who gave the world everything was quietly asking for something simple, to be seen, not worshipped. That letter, hidden behind the mirror, wasn't meant to expose a scandal. It was meant to reveal a truth, that even the most adored man on earth was still just a soul trying to make sense of himself before time ran out. And as we'd soon discover, the real secret buried in that page wasn't about fame or fortune or love. It was about the one thing Elvis could never escape, the weight of his own reflection. When the letter was finally studied in full, what emerged wasn't a list of regrets. It was a confession from a man who no longer knew how to carry his own heart. It's easy to forget that by 1976, his circle had thinned. The Memphis Mafia, who once laughed with him, were mostly gone or distant. The love he once found comforting had become complicated, buried under fame and expectation. And the faith he had clung to all his life had started to feel more like a question than an anchor. Yet even in his despair, there was something else. Hope. A quiet, trembling hope that maybe writing these words down could save him, or at least explain him. He ended one section with, "If God's still listening, tell him I tried. I really did." Those 8 words are pure Elvis. Humble, unsure, still pleading with the heavens like the boy who once sang gospel in a tiny Mississippi church. It wasn't an apology for his fame. It was an apology for forgetting who he was beneath it. And hidden near the bottom of the page was one final mystery. A single line, underlined twice, as if he wanted whoever read it to stop and feel it. "Don't let them build me higher than I can stand." It's a warning, and maybe a wish, because Elvis seemed to know that his death would turn him into something untouchable, something worshipped beyond reason, and that terrified him. He didn't want a marble statue or a gilded shrine. He wanted to be remembered as a man who fell and tried to rise again, not as a myth who never could. When experts compared the ink, they confirmed it matched pens used in the mid-1970s, around the same time he was battling insomnia, dependency, and heartbreak. That means these words weren't written by an aging, fading legend. They came from a man still fighting, still performing, still trying to make sense of his own reflection while the world cheered him on. And that makes this letter more than a confession. It's a farewell that came before the world even knew he was leaving. A plea from a soul drowning quietly in the noise of adoration. He wasn't asking for sympathy, he was asking for release. And perhaps, for the first time, he was finally telling the truth, not to us, but to himself. After the discovery, the letter was quietly placed in a temperature-controlled archive beneath Graceland. The curators debated for months about whether to make it public. Some said it was too personal, that it wasn't meant for eyes outside those walls. Others believed it completed the story, not the one the world celebrated, but the one Elvis was too afraid to tell. When news of the letter eventually leaked, it spread like wildfire. Historians, journalists, fans, everyone wanted to read it. Everyone wanted to know what the king had written in his final confession. But as snippets began circulating, something strange happened. The story stopped being about the letter itself. It became about what it meant. The more people read, the more it forced them to question the version of Elvis they'd worshipped for decades. The glittering myth of the man who had everything. The smooth, smiling hero who seemed untouchable. That image began to crack under the weight of his own handwriting. Because this letter wasn't written by a god. It was written by someone tired of being one. Fans who visited Graceland after its discovery said the place felt different. The rooms looked the same, but the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was heavy. The mirror where the letter had been found became an unofficial shrine, though no plaque marked the spot. People would stand there, staring at their own reflections as if trying to see what he saw when he hid those words behind it. What they didn't realize was that the mirror itself had become the message. Elvis didn't want to be worshipped. He wanted to be understood. And that letter, found decades later, became the only way to hear him without the microphone, the makeup, or the mask. Scholars analyzed his phrasing, his pen pressure, his tone. Some claimed it was a spiritual document, a late-life cry for redemption. Others saw it as a private goodbye, written during a moment when he felt the end closing in. But to those who loved him most, it was simpler than that. It was Elvis trying to forgive himself. Because that's what the words revealed, line after trembling line. A man at war with the reflection he'd created. For every song about love, there was loneliness. For every applause, there was silence waiting backstage. He had lived a life surrounded by noise, the roar of crowds, the hum of cameras, the echo of his own legend. And yet the only sound that truly haunted him was the one that came when the music stopped. In his final years, Elvis had often spoken about spiritual things, reincarnation, redemption, the soul's journey. He once told a friend, "We're all just trying to get home." That line feels heavier now, knowing what we know, because that letter wasn't a map for us. It was a map for him, a way to find his way home through the fog of everything fame had stolen. When Priscilla was told about the discovery, she reportedly grew quiet. She didn't ask to see it. She just said softly, "He was always searching." Lisa Marie, before her passing, mentioned that she had heard whispers of a letter years earlier, one her father wrote when he was not himself anymore. Whether she ever read it, no one knows. But the meaning of that letter goes beyond family or fame. It changes how we understand the man himself. It tells us that behind the rhinestones and headlines was someone who knew exactly what he'd lost and loved the world enough to leave behind a warning. Don't let the dream destroy the dreamer. Today, Graceland remains the most visited home in America after the White House. Millions still walk its halls, marveling at the gold records, the pink Cadillac, the endless symbols of glory. But somewhere within those walls, hidden once behind a mirror, lies the only artifact that truly shows who he was when no one was looking. A man with shaking hands, writing his truth on thin paper, praying that someday, long after he was gone, someone would finally read it and understand. Because maybe Elvis didn't want the world to remember him as a legend who lived forever. Maybe he wanted to be remembered as a man who finally found peace. And in that one fragile letter, sealed in time and soaked in sorrow, he finally did. Maybe the real story of Elvis Presley isn't in the music, or the fame, or the myth, but in the man who tried to make sense of it all. If this letter truly shows who he was, then what else might still be hidden in Graceland's walls? Subscribe and let's uncover it together.